More on the India-Africa partnership. Joining us now from Boston is Larry Seruma. He's the managing principal of Nile Capital Management and has authored several articles on investing in Africa. With us here in our Washington D.C. studio is Aparna Pande. She's a research fellow and director of the Hudson Institute's initiative on the future of India and South Asia. And from Hong Kong, we're joined by Andrew Leung. He's an international and independent China strategist. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Aparna, India making a big push to expand this economic relationship with the African continent. In fact, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi said India and Africa are made for each other. How big is that economic relationship right now, and does it thrive in any particular sectors?
Thanks, Anand. It is big, but it's not as big as many of India's other relationships. So the entire African continent, I think it's about $90 billion in bilateral trade, which would make, I think, that India's sixth largest trading partner. Out of that, I believe Nigeria and South Africa are the two largest countries. It's big for India, not just in the economic arena, actually. For India, the relations with Africa are historic. They are strategic and diplomatic because India believes that if it has these countries which were former colonies, with which India sympathized, it increases India's weightage in the world. And also in other arenas like agriculture, rural development, information technology now, and with some countries even oil and gas. So those are some of the arenas which are big. And there are others India wants to develop, like India would like to provide, have a more, let's say, digital technology and information technology relationship.
Of course, they have a common colonial history as well.
Yes, they do. And that's why, India was among the countries which championed decolonization. And India's own national movement was started, Mahatma Gandhi, he started in South Africa. And from South Africa, he went to India. So the South African National Congress, Gandhi was one of the predecessors. So India has that very old relationship. And lastly, education. Not only does India provide scholarships, it has increased to almost 50,000 in the last summit,
right, yeah.
But there are many Indian teachers, Indian doctors who work and have been working and teaching in many African countries for years now.
Larry, India's biggest trading partners have been those countries in the Middle East, in Europe, in the United States, and of course in Asia as well. Why then now this outreach to Africa?
I think there are a number of reasons. Most importantly, there has, as the guest speakers spoke before, there's this long-term relationship between India and Africa that has been there for quite some time, and it varies by country, but the relationship has been there. What we see in the market is that we see a lot of Indian companies increasing investments in Africa, especially in the pharmaceutical business, companies like Cipla. Outside pharmaceuticals, there are some other industries where, again, we see a lot of Indian companies increasing investments in Africa, in some cases trying to acquire African businesses. I know not so long ago there was Bharti Airtel wanting to buy MTN, which is the big South African mobile network operator. So we are seeing this. Now, why now? I think one of the reasons is that a lot of countries are looking to grow by focusing on emerging markets away from the traditional areas of trade, which has been developed markets. So this is a good strategy for India to pursue, and it does have some very deep ties with Africa that I think the strategy has far much more probability of success.
Andrew, as Aparna pointed out, the cost of the trade between India and Africa right now is around $90 billion. But between China and Africa, it's already $200 billion. And I'm wondering, to what extent does the new Indian outreach pose a challenge to China's traditional dominance on the African continent?
Well, of course, China's engagement with Africa is very different from the West engagement because China's financial flows are not entirely aid, and they are usually tied concessionary loans, and these concessionary loans are tied to usually tied to infrastructural projects. Now, infrastructural projects would include schools, hospitals, roads, power companies, power utilities, all this kind of infrastructure that would be required for Africa's future development. But then the money for this infrastructural projects are usually sit in an escrow account in Beijing for payment to Chinese contractors carrying out all these projects on the ground. Now that way, it minimizes the chances of the money being lost in corruption. I'm not saying that this is entirely prevents corruption, but at least it minimizes the chance of corruption. Secondly, the China's financial flows are usually integrated because it's state coordinated by the Chinese state. That's why they're able to invest in schools and hospitals, which Western multinationals, of course, they are not too interested because these projects don't make money.
All right, Aparna, is the Indian relationship very different to the one that Andrew has been describing?
Absolutely. India has a longer relationship. It's more historical. There is a large Indian diaspora, many Indian who've been living for centuries in many countries. And India's practice normally is that India, even if Indian companies do go in, when they go in, they hire local labor. They will bring in some technicians, but it's more technology transfer or training. It's not bringing in Indian labor from outside. The difference which has been is that China has been a lot better in actually implementing its infrastructure projects. India has been a lot slower in implementing it. And so that's the one arena where India has to really improve, is actually when it, for example, in 2008, India offered $8 billion in concessional credit in the first India-Africa summit, and this time they've announced $10 billion. But we actually not, I think we're only 60% of the original $8 billion had actually been sort of implemented, and they actually reached the ground. So India has to do a better on that, but we have a much better relationship because of, let's say, our soft power relationship. I mean, the people, education, even Bollywood. I mean, all this has sort of built a much better relationship between India and the continent.
Larry, India, of course, recently hosted the biggest ever African summit. What was the significance of that summit? And I'm wondering if India is trying to play catch-up here, because Prime Minister Narendra Modi has yet to make a visit to mainland Africa.
So there's a bit of truth in that. As we have seen, China has been very aggressive in Africa, and the Chinese premier has been on a visit to Africa on many times. So is the U.S. president. India is catching up, but the relationship is different, given the fact that India has a much more stronger historical relationship with Africa. But I think the significance of this is to really signal to the African presidents that India is committed to Africa and Africa trade. When I look at Indian presence in some regions of Africa, say you look at East Africa, the Indian population has been in the region for a while. The nature of investments tend to be more focused on manufacturing, agriculture, pharmaceutical. The nature of these industries tend to be much more long-term, whereas in some of the newer players, the nature of engagement is more around trade and commerce, which tend to be short-term investments that any other event happens in the market, it's easy to close. But the nature of Indian businesses in Africa tend to be much more long-term and have a much more longer commitment. So, and I think the Premier is re-emphasizing those long, deep roots between Africa and India. The other component is that India is obviously facing its own challenges, especially with regard to exporting into the developed markets. So this is an area where they have an advantage, and which, if they capitalize on it, they can be able to improve their terms of trade. So yeah, so overall, even though it's a catch-up, it's a very good signal.
Andrew, does China and India see each other as rivals in doing business on the African continent, or are there areas of mutual cooperation?
I think there is a bit of rivalry. I mean, there is not only in Africa, but also around Asia, particularly in the Indian Ocean. And always China is seen by India as a kind of rival, allying with its arch enemy, Pakistan, and the so-called the string of pearls of China investments and also relationships with a number of ports which Africa sees is surrounding kind of India. But on the other hand, China is also a large market for Indian businesses, and in fact, China has already become one of India's largest trading partners. As far as Africa is concerned, of course, China is Africa's biggest trading partner, and in terms of investments, it far outclasses India, and also in terms of the number of countries. India's trade, even though it has expanded 16 times in 15 years in Africa, it hasn't reached the target in 2015. But in terms of the outreach to number of African countries, China's footprint is much, much wider.